Okay, we're recording. Um, it's a pleasure to be here in the Central Coast of California with Paul Stolpman, who spent many years working at the federal U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on air pollution issues. Paul, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and the kinds of things that you were involved with at EPA?
Sure. I started at EPA back when it began, back in 1971, and immediately I got thrown into issues related to the automobile. So the first thing I worked on was getting emissions controls on automobiles. So they primarily focused on catalytic converters, what it took to get catalytic converters to work. So I had to work on getting lead out of gasoline, big issue. Not only because it is necessary to keep catalysts alive, but as a health consequence, it was one of the major things we got done at EPA. I then moved from those issues to things like vapor recovery on gas stations that you all probably see today. Then I moved into energy issues, primarily power plants. So I got involved in issues related to stack heights, new source standards for new coal-fired power plants and things like that. And then later on I got more involved in international activities, so I began to work internationally on getting a international protocol to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions. That took me into issues related to climate change. From there I actually took a job over in Paris at the OECD, where I got deeply involved in the climate change issues and energy issues. And then at the end of my career, the last 10 years, I actually ran three major programs. The program to protect the ozone layer, the climate change programs that EPA ran, and all of our emissions trading programs. So
Wow.
where we had set up marketable permit trading, those were all run out of my office.
Wow. Well, that's a really fascinating span of issues and an enormous amount of time at EPA from its very inception to its more mature state.
Right.
I'm just curious, what were one or two of the most interesting or colorful people that you met while at EPA?
Well, clearly the best person I met or worked for would be Bill Ruckelshaus. He, without doubt, was our best leader. He had a management style that maybe it just worked for me, I don't know, but I think it worked for all of us. He had a sense of humor. He was willing to take on issues. He was willing to take on the White House, which virtually in order to get anything done, no matter what the administration, it seemed, we had to have an administrator that was willing to take on the White House, or at least to take on OMB and the mechanics around the president. And if we didn't have that, and in many cases we didn't have that, we really didn't get that much done. But Bill was willing to he took on the auto industry, supported us at the White House on that.
In the early 1970s.
In the early days. And that really set the tone for EPA being willing to take industry on and get something done. If he hadn't done that, if we hadn't accomplished in the first 3 years, if we hadn't taken on Detroit and insisted that they actually put catalytic converters on and insisted that they meet the standards that were set out in the 70 Clean Air Act, and the environment wouldn't be as clean today as it is now.
So what do you mean when you say he took on the White House in those early days? And of course he came back again under the Reagan administration, but here you're referring to under Nixon and Ford, right?
It would have been Nixon, right? Nixon signed the Clean Air Act, but he wasn't in love with environmental protection. It was a pure political instinct on his part to go ahead and sign that thing. So the auto industry was adamantly opposed to the emission standards that were in the Clean Air Act, and they were making an argument that we were going to put them out of business. It's a classic argument. You hear it all the time, and
You
you
do.
have to be
You do.
willing to face up to the fact that no, this isn't going to do that.
Mhm.
In many cases, and in this case, environmental standards led to the improvement of technology of our cars, and but for our pushing on emissions, you wouldn't have seen the advent of all the new carburation and the electronics, all of the things that have made cars way better than they used to be, and that was really introduced and advanced very rapidly because of the emissions controls that we insisted that they put on.
And so there was pushback from the White House, and Ruckelshaus House said,
Sure.
no, this is what we're going to
Yeah,
do, and
absolutely.
this is defensible and will be okay in court.
Yes. And you need an administrator to do that, and you need it today, and you needed it then, and we've needed it all the way in between. And we had some administrators that just weren't willing to do that, or some presidents that were unwilling to do that. Take Clinton, for example. You would have thought Clinton would be a perfect environmental advocate, that we would have gotten a lot done during the Clinton administration.
Absolutely.
Well, in fact, we didn't get that much done. And in part it was because he was unwilling, particularly on climate change, he was unwilling to take an issue that he knew the Senate, if he took a climate change protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, to the Senate for ratification, he knew he'd lose that battle. But rather than taking on the battle and seeing if he could win it, and maybe getting lucky and winning it, they just basically backed off and wouldn't submit it to the Senate for ratification.
And this means that even after Gore had invested all that time and had made all those concessions to businesses as well in the protocol, that Gore was also not willing to push?
It's hard to tell Gore, Clinton. Yeah, I would say that it was. I think they just decided politically that they were not strong enough. They just weren't going to take it on. The White House has, in my mind, whether today it's true or not, I don't know. But back when I was working with them, the White House tended to come to the positions that if they didn't have the votes, they weren't willing to take on the issue. They weren't willing to actually go up there and sell it. They wanted to determine ahead of time whether they could win it or not. Politically, they determined that that was the smart way to operate. I personally have a problem with that, but I had that problem also at EPA. If the head of EPA oftentimes thought, well, we just can't get this through OMB, or we can't get this through the White House, they won't even take the issue there. They'll kill it at EPA or kill it at the staff level. My view was, it's our job to do the right thing. If it's the right thing, we should be taking it to OMB and the White House and fighting for it.
Sure.
So lots of stuff got killed prematurely because of the unwillingness to expend the political capital it takes to at least try to do the right thing. So we've done a lot of good, but along the way we left a lot of stuff to linger for a long time because we didn't think we could sell it appropriately, either at the White House or, if not the White House, in the Congress.
There was really a narrow window after the signing of the protocol and the Lewinsky scandal. So that would have been the window in which Clinton still had some political capital.
Well, it turns out there's lots of narrow windows. For example, the Clean Air Act got amended, I think, twice from after 1970. And we came to the conclusion that you had about a 6-month window after there was a new president that you could get a Clean Air Act amendment through. So then, if that's true, then they have to decide whether that's one of the major things they're going to do in their first 6 months, because all new presidents come in and think, I've got 90 days or 120 days or whatever to get done what I want to get done. So, yeah, there are a lot of narrow windows, and you just got to figure out, how to fit in what you want to get done into those windows.
And you have to recognize the window and jump through.
And decide what your priorities are.
Right. So then in the Bush administration, there was some hope that President George W. Bush would actually meet his commitment to fulfilled the requirements or the commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, but then he backed down, and you were at EPA during that time,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. I was with Governor Christie Whitman when she met with a lot of industry types, and one of her favorite things to say was, "Well, if you know one thing about this president, you know he lives up to his commitments." And it turns out that Bush had made a speech somewhere, I think in Michigan, where he said he was going to implement he was going to implement the climate change protocols, and it turns out that didn't happen. There was a lengthy, in that while she was saying all of this, and I was with her during many of those meetings, she was saying this to industry, and we were all getting geared up because we believed it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I traveled with her to an international meeting, and she was telling international leaders, the president, this president means what he says. Well, it turns out she didn't really know what was going on back in D.C., and when she returned from that international trip, and it might have actually been while we were there, an announcement was made that we weren't going to proceed, we weren't going to submit this to the Senate, and that killed it for at least 8 years at that point. So
and then began the campaigns within the White House to even alter scientific documents.
That part of it was and that's an emerging thing that's going on in all levels of government. I face now that I'm here in California, I have that type of scientific naysaying going on here on a local issue I'm working on. But I saw that evolve over time, where trying to discredit science, legitimate science, became an art form almost, and was used particularly in the climate debate. But you'll find it now in all debates. Well, you'll find it in presidential debates. I mean, it's there's just a lot of that going on out there, and I think it's unfortunate because we should be able to rely on the consensus of science. But the other thing that we saw during this time was this an evolution to rely on voluntary actions by industry. Now, I shouldn't complain. I ran one of the biggest voluntary programs on climate change, the Energy Star program.
Right.
Not only Energy Star, but we had voluntary programs going on landfills and other industry commitments, and so we had a massive amount of money actually going into these voluntary programs. And the thing I found, and there'll be this debate going on today over whether to use emissions trading for carbon control. I ran both the emissions trading programs and all these voluntary programs, and I can tell you for sure it is way more efficient to run an emissions trading program, just from a sheer government expenditure
From
program.
the administrative resources?
To run a voluntary program, they gave me, they started throwing money at me because it was voluntary. It must have been 4 times the cost to run a voluntary program, and 4 times the people to accomplish the same things I could have done and did do with an emissions trading program. So just from a sheer good government perspective, a well-run, regulatory-based market program, and that's not an oxymoron. I mean, any market in order to work has to be based on solid rules, or there will be no confidence, you won't get the right price signal.
There will be cheating.
There'll be all of that, and it'll undercut the market. So you need a good regulatory base, and we've got frogs.
They're entering into the conversation.
That's right.
Let me just end with one final question. There are many pundits out there, columnists, energy experts, who write again and again that what we really need is a good carbon tax. And I'm just wondering what you feel about the political feasibility of a carbon tax, and how that might work vis-a-vis an emissions trading program.
Well, I don't think you would have both. I mean, you know, you'd either have a carbon
Right,
tax
sure. One or the
you'd
other.
have a trading program. As an economist, I could go with either one. I mean, they'd both work. Politically, I mean, there are problems with the tax. You set the tax and you're not quite sure what it'll accomplish.
Right.
You set an emissions trading program, especially one that's got a cap and trade program. You know what you're going to accomplish environmentally. There are ways to get the right price signal sent and basically not create a lot of windfalls, which we worry about in a cap and trade program. But I could support either. Which one is more politically feasible? You know, they're both difficult. They're both very difficult. And I'm not sure one is more politically palatable than the other, frankly. If you did a tax, you'd have to set up compensating subsidies of some kind, so that it didn't fall regressively on society.
You'd have to pass back some of the money to the...
So there'd have to be some kind of pass back, and that would be complicated. But a good emissions trading rule is also very complicated, and so I wouldn't have a preference for one or the other. You know, a tax might be easier to implement. An emissions trading program, given all the measurements that would be, you know, given all the diversity of sources of carbon, it'd be a lot more difficult than the programs I ran, which were primarily aimed at large power plants emitting sulfur. So a tax has some pluses. So I wouldn't weigh in on which one's better at all.
Although we do now have the European Union having forged ahead of us with an emissions trading program for greenhouse gases. So
and California, as of this week, I think, will kick its program.
That's right. So there'll be some learning done by other large entities that the U.S. government could benefit from.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome.
And I'll let you now enjoy the rest of this beautiful day.
Yeah.